Okay, last but not least is the Spanish-American War, and really, in a lot of ways, you could probably, with the lectures that you've heard related to the Gilded Age, you could probably jumble these all together. Like again, this is a history schmush bubble, right? There's a lot of these things that are happening at the same time, um, but the Spanish-American War is kind of its own kind of concept. So even though it's happening within kind of the context of imperialism, the context of overproduction and economic expansion, and questions about nativism, questions about immigration. Spanish American War has its own kind of unique concepts that are related to that, right? And the Spanish American War is notable because in 1898, the United States basically kicks Spain's butt. And when that happens, it's kind of telling the world, hey, the US is here, right? It's really bringing the United States onto the global stage in a way that it had never been before. So we're kicking off the 20th century with the United States really having made a statement about who they are, what they're capable of, and even in kind of a subtle way, what their goals are long term. So we're going to make sure we understand the causes of the war and how it impacts the United States globally, right? So some background on Cuba. Cuba was a colony of Spain. Of course, Spain was kind of a dying empire. Matter of fact, by this point, I think that it only had like Cuba and I think maybe one little area in South America. Like it was basically it wasn't an empire much anymore, right? I think they had the Philippines. And so Spain, these were kind of the last holdings of what was the once great Spanish Empire. And Cuba, of course, wanted to get rid of Spain, right? They didn't want Spain there. Spain was this other country. And Cuba was really frustrated because they felt like it had been used as kind of this plantation economy. This was very common with the Caribbean islands. All the European powers had really kind of used these islands for sugar and coffee production, and all the subsequent things that go with that. And you can think, picture in your mind American slavery, and that's kind of the outcome of to these particular countries and to these indigenous people, who, this is what's going to happen there, right? They're being exploited. They're working really hard hours. And so they want a chance to develop on their own, right? To rule themselves. And so, they're pressing for independence, right? And so you have kind of this persistent revolution that's happening, and in the course of this kind of persistent revolution happening, you have the U.S. trying to decide whether it's going to get involved or not. It sends a battleship to Cuba, and the battleship Maine explodes, and this is what's going to be kind of the impetus for the U.S. getting involved in the war. But and of course, that's got its own issues too. But the war is not going to last very long. It's going to only last 6 months. And so the U.S. is really going to kind of kick Spain's butt. They're going to negotiate an end to this war. And the U.S. is going to come away with a great deal of territory, and certainly an even greater deal of kind of standing among the global community. This particular cartoon is kind of your classic call to action. So one of the concepts related to the Spanish-American War is the concept of yellow journalism, or propaganda. The fact that the news media really kind of focused on inflaming the sentiment to go to war. In fact, I think it was William Randolph Hearst or I'm pretty sure it was Hearst, not Pulitzer, that said, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. So, you really kind of have, if you're interested in media and journalism, right, this is kind of when you see that yellow journalism being a huge factor in controlling U.S. foreign policy. And this picture right here pretty much says it all, with Uncle Sam, pushing up his sleeves, getting ready to go fight. So what happens with Cuba in Spain is that they're dealing with these kind of issues of Cuba wanting independence. And so Spain keeps sending troops over there. One of the things that they do, or they enact these concentration camps. Remember me saying that, you have countries beginning to pick up on this idea that the United States had used with the American Indian reservations, right? You see Britain using that in South Africa. You see Spain using it in Cuba. So you start to see countries beginning to do those sort of things. So they have these concentration camps, and in these concentration camps, you have starvation, you have disease, and it just, in a lot of ways, I mean, we can look at what the Spanish are doing and say that it was wrong, but what the Spanish are doing is very typical for what other European powers are doing. It's very typical for what the United States did, especially if you're talking about the Battle of Wounded Knee. So understand that it's not. I'm not saying it's good what they were doing to the Cubans. But what I am saying is it's not any different. But the United States doesn't see it that way, right? Yellow journalism is making a lot of stories about the horribleness of the Spanish to the Cubans, and they're saying, oh, we've got to take action, like this can't happen off the coast of Florida. And so it kind of begins to get tangled up in these concerns about finding a new type of frontier, about having economic expansion, about getting more markets for more stuff. Like this is what you start to see happening. And so it's going to really kind of capture the imagination in a lot of ways. And so again, you have the United States kind of engaging in support, so that you have Spain exiling certain groups, and then the U.S. helps them, and it's just back and forth, right? So the U.S. is not really a neutral party in this. Even going back to the early 1890s, 1887, the U.S. is engaged in actions that are kind of stirring up trouble, right, in Cuba, and so Spain has a reason to be a little bit frustrated. And of course, the U.S. propaganda is going on, right? And so what will happen, particularly as we're moving towards President McKinley, is that the revolution in Cuba kind of heats up once again, and you start to have some violence. It's starting to interfere with sugar production. And so McKinley basically tells Spain in 1897, get control. We don't like having this off the coast of Florida, and basically says, hey, we want you to negotiate, right? Well, Spain, who's much weaker than the United States at this point, does actually offer self-government, but to Cuba, but insists that they stay a part of the Spanish Empire. And Cuba rejects that, right? Now, keep in mind, part of why they're going to reject that is there's a lot of U.S. support for Cuban independence. The U.S. is sending money, they're sending guns, there's, newspaper press. And so you end up having a riot happening in Spain, and you have some American businesses affected. So McKinley sends the USS Maine to Cuba to keep an eye on American interests. In the process of doing this, you get a letter from a Spanish diplomat that basically insults President McKinley. And then all of this is followed up by the explosion of the USS Maine. And of course, newspapers say, oh, it was the Spanish. The Spanish blew it up because the Spanish didn't want the U.S. to have, to have a ship there. You have Teddy Roosevelt claiming that, oh, yes, it had to be the Spanish, all this kind of stuff. And so this is all taking place. On April 11th, McKinley asked Congress to authorize the use of force, and Congress will ultimately do that. Now, they'll do that because you'll have some senators that will say, we'll only authorize the declaration of war if we guarantee Cuba's independence, right? So you have a thing called the Teller Amendment to this declaration of war that says that the U.S. is only in this to support Cuban independence, that we are not going to take it over as a territory. And that's important to keep in mind because that will affect how the U.S. deals with Cuba on down the line. Another little interesting side note, what they discover in the 1970s when they start doing some investigation is that the reason the Maine exploded was because they had put their ammunition too close to the boilers, and so they got too hot and they exploded, and that's what actually caused the explosion. But certainly in 1898, nobody knew that. Everyone made the assumption that it had to have been the Spanish. And again, this is where the relationship of yellow journalism comes in. Teddy Roosevelt is encouraging this. He has a really close relationship with the press, and so he's fanning that flame. And so it just kind of takes on a life of its own. And so poor McKinley, who had actually tried to avoid engagement in Cuba, is really kind of left with no other choice. There's so much public pressure to go to war. Um, and so keep in mind that role of kind of journalism. And so what will happen, just kind of the war, like I said, it's over really very quick within a few weeks, really. I mean, even though the war technically goes on for like 6 months, actual fighting is only for a couple of months. One of the interesting little side notes, and put a pin in this idea, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and had really kind of driven a lot of the investment in the Navy, he's going to resign his post and kind of formulate an ancillary or an auxiliary group called the Rough Riders. These are volunteers that will provide their own stuff, and they will go fight with the army, right? And think of it like kind of like a militia group, so to speak. And so Teddy Roosevelt will raise the Rough Riders. They'll go fight in Cuba. And fight on Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. And so he's doing this because he wants the opportunity to go fight. He wants the opportunity to fight in the country. There's a whole backstory about Roosevelt and his family and how his dad didn't fight in the Civil War, and Roosevelt felt like he had to redeem that. Lots of kind of stuff like that. But the gist of it is Roosevelt creates these Rough Riders, becomes very famous for doing so. And so this is one of the reasons why in 1900 he'll run with McKinley as vice president. And then, of course, that puts him in position to then become president when McKinley is assassinated. And then that will usher in the progressive era. So that's why we kind of want to know Teddy Roosevelt's role within the Spanish-American War. Pretty quickly, the Spanish Navy is chased out of the harbor. U.S. will pretty quickly get control of Cuba. They'll also get control of Puerto Rico, and they'll also get control of the Philippines. But the Philippines are a different kind of theater, right? So you've got Cuba and Puerto Rico in one place. We'll see that there's a ceasefire declared on August 12th, 1898, and then a Treaty of Paris in 1898 that will guarantee Cuban independence. And the U.S. will pay for Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And this will usher in the United States as a world power. So this is Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Kind of classic picture there. You will have the Navy as a significant piece of the Spanish-American War. Thanks to Teddy Roosevelt and Mahan's naval theory. And Spain is not nearly as advanced as the United States. So the U.S. will blockade Cuba. They will attack the Philippines, and Commodore Dewey will have this really kind of successful attack in Manila. He will actually be helped by independent forces. The Philippines was having an independence movement as well. And so he basically kind of reaches out, and the Philippines make this assumption, well, the U.S. is there to guarantee Cuban independence, so surely they're there to guarantee our independence too. And so the Filipinos actually help the United States defeat the Spanish, chase the Spanish out of the Philippines. But then when the U.S. when the war's over and the Treaty of Paris is done, and the U.S. buys the Philippines, there's some kind of frustration with that. And then what you're going to see happening is another couple years of conflict on the Philippines, because the U.S. is trying to get control of these, Filipino groups that are fighting against domination, right? They want to be independent. And so you're going to have kind of this process with rebel forces that really is going to be a precursor. Like you can get kind of a sense of what's going to be facing the United States as they get into Korea, as they get into Vietnam later in the 20th century. So you kind of get a clue into that. William Howard Taft, who you might have remembered me mentioning in relation to dollar diplomacy, Teddy Roosevelt puts him in charge of the Philippines, and Taft will be the governor there, and he will do a lot of work to kind of reduce the power of the military, get the military to back off, and to make some major improvements in education and healthcare and transportation to kind of calm things down in the Philippines. And of course, when Taft leaves his role as the governor of the Philippines, he will then go on, to run for president, right? He'll be Secretary of War, all kinds of different things. And the U.S. will control the Philippines until independence is granted after World War II in 1946. So Commodore Dewey. And so the big question at the end of the Spanish-American War in August of 1898 is, so what do we do now? right? Especially with the Philippines, right? Because you don't have a Teller Amendment with the Philippines guaranteeing independence, right? So what do we do about Puerto Rico? What do we do about all these other places, right? And there's a huge debate, right? You've got anti-imperialists who are very adamant the U.S. does not need to engage in global power. Think about Washington's farewell address. We have enough problems at home with urbanization and poverty. We don't need to take on problems other places. This might bring, uneducated workers to the United States. And you have people that are calling out this idea that the U.S. is somehow promoting democracy and civilization. What do you mean we're promoting democracy? We're going in and taking over these territories just the way Imperial Spain did, right? So there are people who are pushing against this, as well as there being people who are pushing for it, that this makes the United States equal in power to countries like Great Britain. This is going to make the United States an economic powerhouse, that we're doing the world a favor because the U.S. is so unique. So there's lots of kind of interesting debates about imperialism versus anti-imperialism. So I encourage you to kind of explore that through the textbook and that sort of thing. This is your classic kind of picture. Here's the United States, Columbia, the female representation, Uncle Sam, the male representation. You've got the West, you've got Native Americans, you've got, other kind of people, in the background there. And then now all of a sudden we wake up and we've got 4 new territories, right? Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. And what are we supposed to do with these territories? How do we do this? In relation to Puerto Rico, what we do pretty quickly is we make it an unincorporated territory, which basically means it has no rights. The U.S. is in complete control. Puerto Ricans aren't citizens. They're not anything. And this is kind of the backstory for Puerto Rico, right? So some of the debates in the last year have talked about making Puerto Rico a state. And so there have been questions about this. But the reality is, the origin of Puerto Rico, it is an American territory, and it has been since 1900. And so, like, the question that we have now in 2021 is what is our responsibility to Puerto Rico? Now, eventually we do kind of change some of the rules so it's not as harsh as the 4-Acre Act initially made it. But just kind of keep in mind, this is the backstory with Puerto Rico. And I also, on a kind of a personal note, 4-Acre is kind of in my family tree. My maiden name is 4-Acre. He was a senator from Ohio. So this is kind of how I'm interested in kind of Gilded Age politics, because I know probably way more about him than I should. But kind of this is the backstory with Puerto Rico, right? So we bring Puerto Rico in as an unincorporated territory. We have the Philippines as a territory. We have Guam as a territory. But what are we going to do with Cuba? Because remember, the Teller Amendment had said that Cuba had to be independent. But once the war is over, once we have the Treaty of Paris, you have people that are arguing, no, wait a minute, we won this war. We should take Cuba for ourselves, right? And you have to understand, people had talked about claiming Cuba for a long time, going back to the 1850s, right, when we had the slavery question. And so the U.S. is kind of, they come in initially and they say, yes, we'll give Cuba their independence, but we're gonna keep an eye on things. We want to make sure that they have a democratic constitution, right? So we're gonna have a military governor, and we're gonna help control the creation of the Constitution. And so they pass a thing called the Platt Amendment, which essentially maintains Cuban independence, but wink, wink, the U.S. is largely in control. It's basically a protectorate is what happens. The U.S. gains naval stations. We control Cuban debt so that there won't be foreign intervention. Cuba has to do everything with American approval. And that is essentially true until you get to like the 1930s. And even then, once you have an actual official Cuban government that's not tightly overseen by the United States significantly influences Cuban policy up until Castro takes over. So this is part of the backstory with Cuba, and why there's kind of bad feelings, why you have Cuban Americans that are really upset about Castro. And this is why in places like Florida, Cuba is a voting issue, right? And so this kind of goes back into what that's all about. And so American and Cuban policy has always been kind of complicated, and it's complicated because of this connection to the Spanish American War. This political cartoon pretty much says it all about the outcomes of the Spanish American War. Notice you have Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines, of course, depicted in a very, racist, ethnic kind of way, which is pretty horrible. Says a lot in and of itself, especially when you've got states sitting in the background, all prim and proper and white and all that kind of stuff. So you have that happening. You have the rules about how to be a democratic country, and the idea is that the U.S. has to teach these countries what to do because they don't know. Right. Pay also particular attention over here. You've got Chinese not being let in to the schoolhouse, the Chinese Exclusion Act. You've got Native Americans stuck over here, not really a part, but they're kind of in school. But obviously it's not very effective. And then you've got African Americans, again, a character in the background, being kind of pushed off to the side. Trying to being forced to do all the work, right? So this is this is a famous imperialism cartoon that kind of depicts that. So keep in mind the factors that contribute to the Spanish-American War, and then how U.S. international relations change, with the idea of naval power and of kind of having the standing, and that the United States gains these territories that profoundly affect U.S. U.S. standing, right? So you want to keep those things in mind as we start moving into kind of the 20th century and start talking about progressivism. These are the factors, and again, this is a history smush bubble: economics, politics, foreign policy, anxieties about what's happening at home, the closing of the frontier. All of these things are mixing together to create these kinds of scenarios. So hopefully this kind of helps supplement what's in the textbook. And then if you have any questions, please let me know.